May 5, 1993. West Memphis, Arkansas. A quiet city pressed against the Mississippi River, separated from Memphis, Tennessee by a single bridge and a line most residents rarely thought about. By nightfall, 3 8-year-old boys had not returned home. By morning, a wooded drainage ditch known locally as Robin Hood Hills would become the center of one of the most debated criminal cases in modern American history. West Memphis was the kind of place where routines rarely changed. Working families, church on Sundays, children on bicycles in the fading light. That Tuesday evening, Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch were last seen riding together. Their disappearance was first treated as the sort of delay that sometimes happens when children lose track of time. As darkness deepened, worry replaced patience. Parents called neighbors. Neighbors joined the search. By the early hours of May 6th, police officers combed the wooded area near the neighborhood. The discovery came in the muddy water of a drainage ditch. The 3 boys were found submerged, their bodies bound with their own shoelaces. The scene was chaotic and emotionally overwhelming for first responders. News traveled quickly. A small community was suddenly facing something it could not immediately explain. The crime scene itself posed difficult questions. The bindings, the location, the condition of the bodies, all would later be debated in courtrooms and documentaries. At the time, investigators moved swiftly. There was public pressure, there was fear, and there was a growing sense that the crime must have been committed by someone capable of calculated cruelty. Attention soon turned toward 3 local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. They were outsiders in a town that valued conformity. Eccles, 18, wore black clothing and read about occult subjects. Baldwin, 16, was quiet and often seen with Eccles. Miskelly, 17, had a documented low IQ and a limited educational background. None of them had prior convictions for violent crime. Rumors had begun circulating almost immediately. The early 1990s were still shadowed by what became known as the Satanic Panic, a period marked by widespread fear of ritualistic crimes. In West Memphis, whispers about occult activity blended with the shock of the murders. For some residents, suspicion hardened quickly. Police questioned Miskelly first. After hours of interrogation, he gave a confession implicating himself, Eccles, and Baldwin. The statement contained inconsistencies. Certain details did not match the physical evidence. The timeline shifted under scrutiny, yet the confession became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. At trial, prosecutors argued that the murders were the result of a satanic ritual carried out by the 3 teenagers. They presented Miskelly's confession, testimony about Eccles' interest in the occult, and witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. The defense countered that there was no physical evidence directly linking the 3 to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no clear motive beyond speculation. Miskelly was tried separately and convicted, receiving a life sentence plus additional years. Eccles and Baldwin were tried together. In 1994, Eccles was sentenced to death. Baldwin received life imprisonment. For many in West Memphis, the verdicts brought a measure of closure. For others, questions lingered. As years passed, those questions grew louder. Journalists, filmmakers, and legal advocates began examining the case files. The documentary series Paradise Lost introduced a wider audience to the story. Viewers saw interrogation footage. They heard expert analysis challenging aspects of the confession. They learned that much of the physical evidence was circumstantial. DNA testing, more advanced than what had been available in 1993, failed to conclusively tie the 3 men to the crime. Some DNA material recovered from the scene did not match Eccles, Baldwin, or Miskelly. The prosecution maintained that absence of DNA did not equate to innocence. The defense argued that it reinforced reasonable doubt. Public campaigns formed. Musicians, actors, and legal organizations called for a re-examination of the case. Court filings cited potential juror misconduct, ineffective counsel, and newly analyzed forensic findings. The Arkansas Supreme Court ordered hearings to consider new evidence. In 2011, after nearly 2 decades of incarceration, an unusual legal resolution emerged. The 3 men entered Alford pleas, a legal mechanism allowing defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution possesses enough evidence to likely secure a conviction. They were sentenced to time served and released from prison that same day. The Alford plea did not declare them innocent. It did not identify another perpetrator. It ended their imprisonment but left the original convictions technically intact. For the families of the victims, the outcome was complex and painful. Some believed justice had been undermined. Others questioned whether the right individuals had ever been convicted. The case remains a subject of legal and public debate. Advocates continue to seek full exoneration through additional DNA testing and legal motions. Critics argue that the original evidence, though imperfect, supported the jury's decision at the time. The wooded drainage ditch in Robin Hood Hills has long since returned to quiet, but the questions raised in 1993 have never fully settled. 3 children lost their lives. 3 teenagers lost nearly 18 years behind bars. A community was divided, then divided again. In West Memphis, the line between certainty and doubt has never been clearly drawn. The file remains open in the minds of many who continue to ask whether justice was truly served or whether it remains unfinished. In the years following their release, the case did not close. It entered a different phase, quieter, more procedural, but no less significant. Legal teams began preparing motions that focused not on emotional appeals or public opinion, but on the physical evidence itself. Advances in forensic science had transformed criminal investigations since 1993. What had once been considered inconclusive could now be re-examined under more refined methods. Among the items preserved from the original investigation were shoelaces used to bind the victims, clothing recovered from the scene, and biological material collected during autopsies. Defense attorneys argued that modern DNA testing, particularly touch DNA analysis, could reveal profiles previously undetectable. They maintained that if the 3 men were not responsible, then someone else's genetic material might still be present. Prosecutors responded cautiously. The state's position remained that the original convictions were legally sound and that the Alford pleas resolved the matter. Yet the existence of untested evidence complicated that stance. Over time, public pressure mounted again, though in a different form than during the early documentary years. This was no longer driven primarily by celebrity advocacy. It was framed as a matter of scientific clarity. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued living with an absence that had never healed. Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch would have grown into adulthood. Instead, their names remained permanently attached to a crime scene frozen in public memory. For some family members, reopening the case meant reopening wounds. For others, it meant pursuing certainty, regardless of where it led. Independent forensic experts revisited the autopsy findings. One of the most debated aspects of the original trial involved the nature of the injuries. Prosecutors had suggested mutilation consistent with ritualistic intent. Later medical reviews questioned whether some injuries could have resulted from post-mortem animal activity in a wooded, waterlogged environment. The distinction was critical. If the injuries were misinterpreted, then the narrative of ritual violence that shaped early suspicion might have been flawed from the beginning. The interrogation of Jesse Misskelley remained another focal point. Recorded segments revealed hours of questioning prior to his taped confession. Critics argued that his intellectual limitations made him vulnerable to suggestion. Supporters of the original verdict countered that he provided details not publicly known at the time. Yet over the years, Analysts noted factual errors within his statement, incorrect times, descriptions inconsistent with physical evidence, sequences that shifted under pressure. Legal scholars began citing the case in discussions about false confessions. Studies conducted after the 1990s demonstrated that lengthy interrogations, especially involving young or cognitively impaired suspects, can produce statements shaped by leading questions. The West Memphis case became part of a broader national conversation about interrogation reform. At the same time, alternative suspects were periodically proposed in public discourse. Some pointed toward individuals with histories of violence who lived in or near the area. Others revisited statements made by acquaintances of the victims' families. None of these theories resulted in formal charges. Each carried its own set of limitations, inconsistencies, or lack of corroboration. Still, their existence underscored a central problem. Uncertainty had replaced closure. Court filings in the 2010s sought access to physical evidence for additional DNA testing. Defense attorneys argued that technological improvements could identify previously undetectable contributors. The state resisted certain requests, citing procedural finality and concerns about the handling of evidence over decades. Legal motions moved slowly through the system, often delayed by technical arguments rather than substantive rulings. Public interest, though no longer at its peak, persisted through podcasts, investigative journalism, and academic reviews. The case became a reference point for debates about wrongful convictions, media influence on trials, and the cultural climate of the early 1990s. Some observers noted how the satanic panic atmosphere may have shaped investigative direction. Others insisted that focusing on cultural context risked overshadowing the brutality of the crime itself. The physical setting of Robin Hood Hills remained largely unchanged: trees, undergrowth, a drainage ditch that carried rainwater through the area. For residents who remembered the search parties and flashing police lights, the landscape carried a different weight. It was not just a patch of woods. It was the place where certainty fractured. In more recent years, renewed legal efforts have focused specifically on advanced DNA sequencing. Techniques capable of generating profiles from minimal or degraded samples now exist. Advocates argue that if unknown DNA profiles are developed, they could be compared against national databases. Such comparisons might either reinforce the original conclusions or point in a new direction entirely. The question underlying every motion is simple but difficult. Is there still evidence capable of providing definitive answers? After decades in storage, environmental exposure, and prior testing, biological material can degrade. Chain of custody documentation must be carefully reviewed. Each step requires judicial approval. For Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., life outside prison brought both freedom and complexity. They emerged into a world transformed by technology and culture. Their identities remain tied to the case. Interviews given after their release often reflect a mixture of relief and unfinished business. They maintain their innocence. They seek full exoneration. Yet the Alford plea remains a legal compromise, one that secured release but preserved the convictions. For law enforcement officials involved in the original investigation, perspectives vary. Some stand firmly by the work done under intense pressure in 1993. Others have acknowledged that investigative standards evolve. Hindsight introduces clarity unavailable in the moment, but hindsight cannot change the past, only reinterpret it. The broader legal community continues to monitor the case as motions progress. Should advanced DNA testing identify another individual, it would reshape the narrative entirely. If testing yields no new profiles, the debate may persist without resolution. In either outcome, the case illustrates the tension between finality and accuracy within the justice system. 3 children were killed. That fact has never been disputed. What remains disputed is who is responsible. The Alford plea ended incarceration but not controversy. The physical evidence remains central, silent, preserved, waiting for science and the courts to determine whether it still holds answers. In West Memphis, decades have passed since May 1993. New residents may know the story only through documentaries or articles. Older residents remember the fear that settled over the community. The bridge between West Memphis and Memphis still carries traffic each day, indifferent to history. Yet beneath the surface of routine life, the case lingers. Files are reopened, motions are filed, evidence is cataloged again. The narrative continues, not in dramatic courtroom confrontations, but in careful laboratory procedures and judicial review. Whether the final chapter will bring clarity or prolong uncertainty remains unknown. What endures is the central question that has defined the case from the beginning. Were 3 teenagers wrongly convicted in a moment of fear, or did a jury, despite imperfections, reach the correct conclusion? Until conclusive evidence emerges, if it ever does, the West Memphis case remains suspended between verdict and doubt, a file that refuses to close completely. As the legal process moved forward, attention increasingly shifted from courtroom arguments to the physical evidence itself. Items sealed decades earlier, cataloged in property rooms, and largely untouched by modern forensic standards. The passage of time had not erased their potential relevance, but it had complicated it. Evidence integrity depends on preservation, documentation, and continuity. Every transfer, every storage condition, every prior test becomes part of the chain that must withstand scrutiny. Defense attorneys petitioned for comprehensive retesting, using technologies unavailable in the early 1990s. Among these were advanced forms of mitochondrial DNA analysis and more sensitive touch DNA recovery methods capable of identifying trace skin cell deposits. Unlike earlier testing, which required larger biological samples, newer techniques could sometimes generate partial profiles from minute material. The argument was straightforward. If biological evidence from the bindings, clothing, or surrounding environment contained genetic material from someone other than the 3 convicted men, that information could materially affect the case. The state's response was measured. Prosecutors emphasized that absence of the defendants, DNA had never been the foundation of the conviction. The case, they maintained, rested on a combination of confession, witness statements, circumstantial elements, and jury evaluation. They also raised concerns about contamination risks over decades of storage and previous handling. Any new DNA findings, they argued, would need careful interpretation. Meanwhile, independent legal organizations examined the procedural history of the trials. Appeals filed in the late 1990s and early 2000s had challenged jury instructions, evidentiary rulings, and claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. Some motions were denied. Others resulted in limited hearings. Over time, the accumulation of appellate decisions created a dense legal record, one that scholars would later analyze in law review articles discussing the balance between procedural finality and substantive justice. Public perception continued evolving. In the years immediately following the convictions, many residents of West Memphis accepted the verdicts as resolution. As documentaries and investigative reporting reached wider audiences, national sentiment began shifting toward skepticism. That shift did not necessarily reflect unanimous agreement about innocence, but it introduced doubt into what had once seemed settled. The cultural climate of 1993 remains central to understanding the case. During that period, law enforcement agencies across the United States faced pressure to address alleged ritualistic crimes tied to occult symbolism. Training materials circulated warning of hidden satanic networks. In hindsight, many of those fears were later regarded as exaggerated or unsupported by empirical evidence. Whether that broader atmosphere influenced investigative assumptions in West Memphis remains debated. Some argue it shaped the narrative from the outset. Others contend that local investigators focused on concrete leads rather than national trends. The confession of Jessie Misskelley continues to anchor discussion. Recorded portions reveal exchanges between interrogators and a teenager who struggled to maintain consistent timelines. Analysts reviewing transcripts have pointed out that certain critical details appeared only after prompting. Supporters of the conviction argue that he described specific elements of the crime scene. Critics note that several of those details were incorrect or had been publicized prior to the interrogation. The reliability of confessions obtained after extended questioning sessions has since become a significant topic in criminal justice reform. Another point of ongoing analysis involves forensic pathology. Expert opinions offered at trial suggested deliberate mutilation. Later reviews by independent pathologists raised the possibility that some injuries may have been caused by post-mortem animal activity in a wooded environment with standing water. This distinction carries substantial weight. If injuries were misinterpreted, the motive theory presented at trial could have been influenced by assumptions rather than conclusive medical findings. Despite years of debate, no alternative suspect has been formally charged. Various individuals have been publicly discussed, often based on rumor or unverified claims. Law enforcement agencies have stated that investigations remain technically open, though active pursuit has varied over time. The difficulty lies in separating credible leads from speculation fueled by media exposure. The 2011 Alford plea resolved immediate incarceration but created a complex legal status. Under this plea, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. acknowledged that prosecutors possessed sufficient evidence for conviction while maintaining claims of innocence. The agreement allowed for release with time served, avoiding further appeals litigation. For the state, it preserved the convictions. For the defendants, it secured freedom but not exoneration. Legal scholars often cite this resolution as an example of pragmatic compromise. Trials can be unpredictable. Appeals can last decades. Evidence can degrade. The plea avoided the uncertainty of a retrial while leaving broader questions unanswered. For some observers, it represented an uneasy balance between risk and relief. In recent years, renewed motions have focused on accessing preserved evidence for updated forensic analysis. Courts have weighed requests carefully, considering statutory requirements governing post-conviction testing. The legal threshold often requires demonstrating that new methods could produce materially relevant results not previously obtainable. Each ruling shapes the trajectory of the case's next phase. For the families of the victims, time has not simplified the emotional landscape. Some family members have expressed confidence in the original verdicts. Others have publicly supported additional testing in pursuit of definitive answers. Their perspectives reflect differing interpretations of justice, whether it lies in preserving a jury's decision or in exhausting every scientific avenue available. The broader implications extend beyond West Memphis. The case is frequently referenced in discussions about wrongful convictions, interrogation standards, forensic reliability, and the influence of community fear on criminal investigations. Academic conferences and legal symposia have analyzed the procedural timeline as a study in how complex cases evolve over decades. At the center remain three boys whose lives ended in 1993. Their identities risk being overshadowed by the controversy that followed. Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, the legal arguments, documentaries, and appeals all originate from the violence that occurred in Robin Hood Hills. Any future development, whether confirming the original conclusions or challenging them, will ultimately return to that fact. Today, the evidence remains preserved under court supervision. Scientific capability continues advancing. DNA databases expand. Analytical thresholds become more sensitive. Each technological improvement renews the possibility that clarity could emerge from material once considered exhausted. Yet clarity is not guaranteed. Biological samples may yield partial or inconclusive results. Profiles may match no one in existing databases. Legal standards may limit how new findings are interpreted relative to earlier verdicts. The justice system operates within procedural frameworks that can both protect and constrain. West Memphis itself has changed over the decades. New businesses have opened. Children play in neighborhoods that once held search parties. For many residents, the case belongs to history. For others, it remains present, an unresolved question embedded in local memory. Whether the final chapter will bring definitive answers depends on a convergence of science, law, and persistence. Until that convergence occurs, the file remains active not only in court records but in public consciousness. The case endures as a reminder that verdicts can be rendered, sentences served, and yet uncertainty still persists. In the quiet woods where the investigation began, there are no markers explaining the debates that followed. Only trees and a drainage channel that carries water after rain. The physical landscape does not testify. The evidence stored in sealed containers may yet do so. And until it does, the story of West Memphis remains suspended between conviction and doubt, its conclusion still unwritten. As the years continue to pass, the case entered a stage defined less by public spectacle and more by procedural persistence. Motions were drafted with careful language, citing statutory provisions that did not exist at the time of the original trials. Post-conviction DNA statutes, enacted in many states after high-profile exonerations across the country, provided pathways for requesting forensic review long after verdicts had been entered. Arkansas had such provisions. The legal debate centered on whether the West Memphis case met the criteria for expanded testing. Attorneys representing Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. argued that emerging technologies, particularly advanced sequencing capable of generating profiles from trace or degraded material, could reveal information unavailable in the 1990s or even during earlier rounds of testing. They pointed to national cases where convictions had been overturned decades later based on newly developed forensic results. The logic was incremental but consistent. Science had evolved. Therefore, unresolved evidence deserved re-examination. State officials maintained that prior testing had already excluded the three men as sources of certain biological material, and that additional testing might not materially alter the legal status created by the Alford pleas. They emphasized that the plea agreement had resolved active litigation, and that reopening forensic analysis required judicial authorization grounded in statutory standards. The court system, operating within procedural boundaries, became the arena for determining whether new testing would proceed. At the same time, independent analysts reviewed archival materials from the original investigation. Police reports, witness statements, and crime scene photographs were re-examined by journalists and legal commentators. Each detail, timelines, search patterns, interview transcripts, was scrutinized for inconsistencies. Some observers focused on the early hours of the search, questioning whether the crime scene had been adequately secured. Others analyzed how quickly suspicion narrowed to the three teenagers. The confession of Jesse Miskelly remained central to this review. Modern interrogation research, supported by empirical studies conducted after the 1990s, has documented how prolonged questioning, leading prompts, and psychological pressure can influence vulnerable individuals. Experts in forensic psychology have referenced the case when discussing the mechanics of false confessions. They note that inaccuracies embedded within a confession can sometimes coexist with correct information if details are fed, intentionally or unintentionally, during questioning. Whether that dynamic occurred in West Memphis remains disputed, but the broader research context has reshaped how such statements are evaluated. Another dimension involves jury perception. Trials in 1994 unfolded in a media environment significantly different from today's. Information traveled primarily through local television and newspapers. Social media did not exist. Jurors relied on what was presented in court, filtered through the evidentiary rules of the time. Cultural narratives, particularly those surrounding alleged occult activity, may have influenced how testimony was interpreted. Legal scholars examining the transcripts have debated whether certain expert testimony would withstand contemporary standards under current evidentiary frameworks. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued navigating a complex landscape. Public discussions about potential wrongful conviction can feel, to grieving relatives, like challenges to a hard-won sense of justice. Yet some family members have expressed support for additional testing, emphasizing that definitive answers would serve everyone involved. The emotional reality is not uniform. It is layered, shaped by personal belief, trust in institutions, and the passage of time. In recent filings, defense attorneys have specifically requested testing on items such as the shoelaces used as bindings and articles of clothing recovered from the scene. These objects are not symbolic. They are physical repositories of potential biological traces. The question is not whether testing is technologically possible, but whether the results would meet legal thresholds for reopening substantive claims. Courts must consider not only scientific feasibility, but also statutory requirements regarding material relevance and procedural posture. Nationally, wrongful conviction databases maintained by legal organizations have documented numerous cases where DNA evidence overturned long-standing verdicts. Those exonerations have influenced public expectations about what forensic science can achieve. Yet experts caution that DNA is not universally decisive. Many crimes, particularly those committed outdoors or involving water exposure, yield limited biological material. Environmental degradation, contamination, and the mere absence of recoverable DNA can complicate interpretation. The West Memphis case sits at this intersection, between optimism about scientific clarity and recognition of forensic limitations. Even if new DNA profiles are developed, they must be contextualized. A profile belonging to an unknown individual does not automatically identify a perpetrator. It may represent incidental transfer. Conversely, failure to identify any new DNA does not conclusively affirm the original convictions. The evidentiary landscape is rarely absolute. Beyond the laboratory, the case has become embedded in American legal discourse. It is cited in discussions about juvenile sentencing, given that two of the defendants were minors at the time of trial. It appears in debates over the death penalty, as Damien Eccles once faced execution. It is referenced in conversations about plea bargaining, particularly the ethical and strategic implications of Alford pleas. In academic settings, the case functions as a study in how law, culture, media, and science interact over extended timelines. The passage of more than 3 decades since May 1993 has altered the context, but not the core question. Generational turnover means that many current residents of West Memphis were not present during the original investigation. Yet the case remains part of the city's identity in national memory. For some, it is a symbol of potential miscarriage of justice. For others, it represents the difficulty of prosecuting a brutal crime in a small community under intense pressure. There have been calls for the involvement of independent forensic laboratories, separate from agencies connected to the original prosecution. Advocates argue that external review enhances public confidence. Opponents caution that procedural safeguards already exist within the judicial system. The debate reflects broader societal tensions regarding institutional trust. As motions continue to move through the courts, timelines stretch. Judicial review is deliberate by design. Each filing must be answered, each request evaluated against precedent. The process can appear slow, but it reflects the structured nature of post-conviction litigation. For the 3 men released in 2011, the pursuit of full exoneration remains ongoing. For the state, maintaining the integrity of prior proceedings remains a priority. For the victims' families, the desire for finality coexists with the possibility that further clarity could emerge. What remains constant is the unresolved space between certainty and doubt. The wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills does not reveal its history to those who pass through it today. The drainage ditch carries rainwater without distinction. The physical setting offers no commentary. The answers, if they exist, lie within preserved evidence and judicial determinations yet to be made. In complex criminal cases, closure is not always synonymous with conclusion. A conviction may stand while questions persist. A release from prison may occur without a declaration of innocence. Legal systems are structured around thresholds, beyond a reasonable doubt, preponderance of evidence, statutory eligibility, not around emotional resolution. The West Memphis case continues to exist within those thresholds. If future forensic analysis identifies new, interpretable genetic material, the case could re-enter courtrooms in a substantive way. If testing yields no actionable findings, debate may continue in public forums without altering legal status. Either outcome will shape how the case is remembered. For now, the file remains active in the sense that motions are pending and evidence preserved. The narrative, once driven by immediate fear and rapid prosecution, now unfolds through laboratory protocols and legal briefs. It is a slower chapter, but not an insignificant one. 3 boys lost their lives in 1993. 3 teenagers were convicted and later released under an unusual plea arrangement. Decades later, science, law, and memory continue to intersect around the same set of facts, until a definitive answer emerges, or until the courts declare that no further review will occur. The case remains open in the only way that still matters, in the ongoing search for certainty within a record marked by both verdict and doubt. As the case moves deeper into its 4th decade, its significance extends beyond a single courtroom or community. What began in May 1993 as a local homicide investigation has evolved into a long-running examination of how justice systems respond under pressure, how evidence is interpreted, and how time alters certainty. Recent legal efforts have focused not only on DNA testing, but also on access, specifically, the right to independently examine and retest physical evidence retained by the state. Defense attorneys have argued that transparency is essential to public confidence. Requests have included permission for outside laboratories to conduct modern sequencing techniques on preserved items. These requests are evaluated under Arkansas law governing post-conviction relief, which requires courts to consider whether new testing could produce materially relevant evidence. At the heart of the legal argument is a narrow but consequential question. If new forensic results were to contradict aspects of the prosecution's original theory, would that be sufficient to reopen substantive proceedings despite the Alford pleas? Courts must weigh procedural finality against the possibility of factual error. Finality serves stability in the justice system. Accuracy serves legitimacy. When the two appear in tension, judges must interpret statutes and precedent with caution. In parallel, national discussions about criminal justice reform have reshaped how older cases are viewed. Since the 1990s, reforms have addressed recording interrogations in full, improving forensic standards, and providing clearer jury instructions in complex cases. Organizations studying wrongful convictions often point to systemic patterns: reliance on confessions obtained after extended questioning, overstated forensic testimony, and cultural bias influencing investigative focus. The West Memphis case is frequently included in these broader analyses, not as proof of error, but as an example of how multiple factors can converge. The Alford plea itself remains controversial. Legally, it allows defendants to assert innocence while acknowledging that sufficient evidence exists for conviction. Critics argue that such pleas blur the line between guilt and exoneration. Supporters contend they offer pragmatic resolution when litigation risks are high. In West Memphis, The plea ended years of appeals and prevented the uncertainty of a retrial, but it also left the record formally intact. The men were freed, yet the convictions were not vacated. For Damien Eccles, who had once faced execution, the plea meant survival. For Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr., it meant release after nearly 18 years. Public interviews since their release have reflected both relief and determination. They have stated their intention to pursue full exoneration. That pursuit requires navigating procedural channels that are often slower and more restrictive than direct appeals. Meanwhile, the families of Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch continue to occupy a different position in the narrative. Their loss remains unchanged regardless of legal developments. Public debate can reopen grief, especially when theories shift or prior conclusions are questioned. Some relatives have spoken publicly about their belief that the original convictions were correct. Others have supported renewed forensic testing. The diversity of perspectives underscores that justice is experienced differently depending on one's role in the case. In West Memphis itself, daily life continues largely removed from national attention. Yet the city's name remains tied to the case in legal textbooks, documentaries, and investigative journalism. The wooded area of Robin Hood Hills has no official memorial marking its place in criminal history. It exists quietly, its significance carried in memory rather than signage. The evidence stored in official custody represents perhaps the last tangible bridge between past and present. Biological material does not age in the same way as public opinion, but it does degrade. Laboratory conditions matter. Documentation matters. If new testing proceeds, it will require meticulous oversight to ensure that results are scientifically sound and legally admissible. Experts caution that even definitive DNA findings may not produce immediate clarity. A single foreign profile might suggest contact but not context. Multiple mixed profiles might complicate interpretation. The absence of usable DNA might reflect environmental degradation rather than absence of involvement. Forensic science is powerful, but it operates within probabilities, not absolutes. The West Memphis case illustrates a broader truth about complex criminal investigations. Resolution is not always synonymous with certainty. A jury can deliberate in good faith based on evidence presented at the time. Later developments can introduce new variables without necessarily proving original bad faith. The justice system evolves. Standards improve. What was considered persuasive evidence in 1994 might be evaluated differently under contemporary scrutiny. As legal motions continue, the outcome remains uncertain. Courts may authorize expanded testing. They may deny it. They may limit the scope. Each decision will add another chapter to a record already spanning decades. For those who follow the case closely, the waiting itself has become part of the narrative. 3 children lost their lives in a wooded drainage ditch in 1993. 3 teenagers were convicted the following year. Nearly 2 decades later, they walked free under a plea that resolved imprisonment but not controversy. Today, the case stands at a quiet crossroads, no longer defined by courtroom drama, yet not fully concluded. Whether future forensic results will shift the balance toward confirmation or contradiction remains unknown. What is certain is that the questions raised in West Memphis have influenced conversations far beyond Arkansas. They have shaped debates about interrogation practices, forensic reliability, plea bargaining, and the meaning of justice itself. And so the file remains open, not only in legal terms but in the ongoing effort to reconcile verdicts with evolving standards. In that space between past decisions and present scrutiny, the story continues. As discussions continue in court filings and legal briefs, the case has gradually shifted from being a question of immediate guilt or innocence to something broader, whether the system that processed it functioned as intended. That distinction matters. Criminal cases are built not only on facts but on procedures, rules governing how facts are gathered, interpreted, and presented. In the years since 2011, attorneys representing the three men have emphasized that modern forensic capabilities could do more than revisit old evidence. They could clarify lingering ambiguity. Advances such as next-generation sequencing and genealogical database comparisons have solved cold cases once considered unsolvable. Across the United States, decades-old investigations have been reopened when preserved biological material produced new leads. Those examples form part of the argument that no case should be considered beyond scientific review if evidence still exists. Yet courts operate within statutory frameworks. A judge must determine whether additional testing meets legal criteria. Is the evidence still in a condition suitable for analysis? Would the results, if favorable to the petitioners, significantly undermine confidence in the original verdict? Does the prior plea agreement restrict certain avenues of relief? Each question requires careful interpretation. Outside the courtroom, public attention ebbs and flows. Documentaries, books, and podcasts periodically renew interest, often introducing the case to audiences too young to remember the original trial. With each retelling, emphasis shifts slightly, sometimes toward alleged investigative errors, sometimes toward the emotional weight borne by the victims' families, sometimes toward the broader social climate of the early 1990s. The narrative has become layered, shaped by perspective as much as by record. For legal scholars, the case remains instructive. It highlights the tension between community fear and evidentiary restraint. In 1993, West Memphis was confronted with a crime that defied easy explanation. The urgency to identify suspects was intense. When suspicion focused on teenagers who did not fit local norms, that suspicion may have gained momentum. Whether that momentum crossed into premature conclusion is the central dispute that persists. Interrogation practices have evolved since the 1990s. Many jurisdictions now require full electronic recording of custodial interviews from start to finish. The purpose is transparency, allowing courts and juries to observe the entire exchange rather than selected excerpts. In retrospect, partial recordings in older cases can leave room for debate about what occurred before the camera was turned on. The West Memphis interrogation of Jesse Misskelley is frequently cited in reform discussions, not as definitive proof of coercion, but as an example of why comprehensive recording standards became necessary. For the men released in 2011, life after incarceration has meant rebuilding in a society transformed by technology and culture. The world they re-entered was connected through digital platforms that amplify advocacy and criticism alike. Supporters continue campaigning for full exoneration. Skeptics continue asserting that juries weighed the evidence and reached lawful conclusions. The conversation persists in public forums far removed from the original Arkansas courtroom. The physical evidence remains central. Each preserved item represents a potential answer that has not yet been definitively obtained. Laboratory protocols, if authorized, will involve contamination safeguards, chain of custody verification, and peer-reviewed methodologies. Any resulting profiles would be compared against state and national databases. If a match were identified, investigators would face a new set of questions: context, opportunity, corroboration. If no match emerges, ambiguity may remain. Science does not promise narrative closure. It provides data, and data must be interpreted within legal standards. A court may determine that inconclusive results do not meet the burden required to overturn long-standing convictions, or it may find that even incremental doubt warrants further review. The families of Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch continue living with the reality that their children's lives were cut short. Legal developments, however significant, do not restore what was lost. Public debate can sometimes overshadow that fact. The passage of decades has not diminished the gravity of May 5, 1993. It has only expanded the number of voices discussing it. West Memphis itself has changed with time. Economic shifts, new generations, and evolving law enforcement practices have reshaped the city, Yet the name remains permanently linked to the case in national consciousness. For some residents, it is an unwanted association. For others, it is part of a history that must be acknowledged honestly. The justice system is structured to deliver verdicts, but it is not structured to eliminate doubt entirely. Doubt can coexist with legal finality. The Alford plea created precisely that space, a legal conclusion without unanimous moral agreement. It resolved incarceration but preserved debate. As motions proceed and courts deliberate, the outcome remains uncertain. What is clear is that the case has transcended its original boundaries. It is no longer solely about three defendants or even one community. It is about how institutions respond to tragedy, how evidence is weighed under pressure, and how time alters perspective. If additional testing moves forward, it may bring clarity. If it does not, the case will continue occupying a unique position in American legal history, part cautionary example, part unresolved question. The wooded area once searched by volunteers remains quiet. The court records remain active. Between those two spaces, nature unchanged and documents evolving, the story continues, measured not in headlines but in motions, rulings, and the enduring search for certainty. As the legal process inches forward, the case has entered a phase defined less by dramatic revelations and more by institutional patience. Court calendars move slowly. Motions are reviewed, responses filed, hearings scheduled and sometimes postponed. For observers accustomed to the urgency of a criminal trial, this stage can appear uneventful. In reality, it is here, within procedural deliberation, that the long-term meaning of the case may ultimately be shaped. One focal point remains the preservation and condition of the physical evidence. Decades in storage raise technical concerns. Biological samples must have been maintained under controlled conditions to remain viable for advanced testing. Defense teams have pressed for independent verification of storage protocols, emphasizing that reliability begins with preservation. The state, in turn, has asserted that evidence was cataloged and retained according to departmental standards. The discussion is technical, but the implications are substantial. If evidence is compromised, opportunities for clarity narrow. Another layer of complexity involves statutory interpretation. Arkansas law, like many jurisdictions, outlines specific criteria under which post-conviction DNA testing may be granted. Petitioners must show that new methods are materially different from those previously used, and that favorable results could raise a reasonable probability of a different outcome. Courts must decide how those standards apply to a case resolved through an Alford plea. Does the plea limit certain claims? Or does the possibility of actual innocence override procedural finality? Judges weigh these questions carefully, aware that their rulings may set precedent. Beyond legal arguments, the case has become part of academic curricula in criminal justice programs. Professors use it to illustrate how investigative momentum can build in small communities. Students examine interrogation transcripts, jury instructions, and forensic testimony. The goal is not to reach a predetermined conclusion, but to understand how evidence is interpreted under pressure. In that context, the West Memphis case functions as a living study rather than a closed chapter. Media portrayals have also evolved. Early coverage focused heavily on the alleged occult elements presented at trial. Later documentaries shifted emphasis toward potential investigative shortcomings. More recent reporting often attempts a balanced reassessment, acknowledging both the brutality of the crime and the contested nature of the convictions. Each retelling shapes public understanding, sometimes reinforcing doubt, sometimes reinforcing belief in the verdicts. For the three men released in 2011, public identity remains inseparable from the case. Interviews and public appearances often return to the same questions. Do you believe full exoneration will come? What would justice look like now? Their responses generally emphasize continued pursuit of definitive forensic answers. Yet legal realities mean that even conclusive DNA findings would initiate another complex legal process, rather than an immediate declaration. For the families of the victims, time has not simplified the emotional terrain. Public scrutiny can feel intrusive. Each new motion reopens memories of 1993. The search for clarity may align with some family members' hopes and conflict with others. There is no single, unified perspective. Grief does not move in uniform direction. The broader criminal justice system has changed significantly since the early 1990s. Standards governing forensic testimony have tightened. Courts now apply more rigorous admissibility tests to certain forms of expert evidence. Interrogation reforms have emphasized recording and safeguarding against coercion. Awareness of wrongful conviction patterns has increased. Whether those changes would have altered the original proceedings is speculative, but the contrast underscores how legal norms evolve. At the center remains the same unresolved core. 3 children were murdered, and the identity of their killer, or killers, remains contested in public discourse. The physical setting of Robin Hood Hills has long since returned to ordinary quiet. No visible sign indicates its place in legal history. Yet within court archives and laboratory storage rooms, the case continues to exist in tangible form. If advanced DNA testing proceeds and produces a viable profile matching an individual not previously implicated, the consequences would extend beyond exoneration claims. Law enforcement would face the responsibility of investigating anew. Questions about earlier investigative direction would resurface. If no such profile emerges, the existing convictions, preserved through the Alford plea, may remain legally intact, even if debate continues. The justice system's strength lies partly in its capacity for review. Appeals, post-conviction motions, and forensic advancements provide mechanisms for correction. But that same system values stability. At some point, courts must decide whether further review serves justice or merely prolongs uncertainty. Striking that balance is rarely simple. In West Memphis, daily life continues. Schools operate. Traffic crosses the Mississippi River Bridge. New residents may know the story only in outline. For those who remember the search parties and police lights of May 1993, the memory is sharper. The city carries both its present and its past. As the case approaches the midpoint of its 4th decade, it stands as a reminder that legal resolution does not always equal collective agreement. Verdicts can be rendered. Sentences can be served. Pleas can be entered. Yet questions may remain, sustained by evolving science and shifting perspective. Whether the next chapter brings decisive evidence or continued ambiguity is uncertain. What is certain is that the pursuit of clarity has not fully ended. In quiet courtrooms and forensic laboratories, the file remains active, less visible than it once was, but not closed. Time has a way of softening headlines but sharpening questions. More than 3 decades have passed since May 5, 1993, yet the case remains suspended between what was decided and what is still debated. Courtrooms have emptied. Appeals have been argued. A plea agreement has been entered. But resolution, in the fullest sense of the word, has remained elusive. If additional forensic testing is granted and yields meaningful results, the consequences will unfold deliberately. New findings would not instantly rewrite history. They would be reviewed, challenged, interpreted. Experts would testify. Judges would rule. The law moves in measured steps, even when the subject is urgency itself. Should conclusive evidence point in a new direction, the system would be forced to confront not only the facts of 1993, but the decisions that followed in 1994. If, however, testing produces no definitive answers, the case may settle into a permanent state of uncertainty. The Alford pleas would continue to stand. The convictions would remain recorded. Public debate would likely persist, though perhaps with less intensity over time. The absence of clarity can, in some cases, become its own conclusion. The West Memphis case has come to represent more than a single investigation. It reflects how communities respond to shock. It illustrates how cultural climate can intersect with criminal suspicion. It demonstrates the enduring impact of confession evidence and the evolving role of forensic science. And it underscores a difficult truth. Justice systems are designed to reach verdicts, but they cannot always eliminate doubt. For the families of Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch, the passage of time does not alter the loss. Their children remain at the center of the story, even when public focus shifts toward legal procedure. For Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., the years spent in prison cannot be returned. Their release marked an end to incarceration, but not an end to the questions attached to their names. Robin Hood Hills remains quiet. Trees stand where searchers once walked. The drainage ditch carries water when it rains. There is no visible trace of the arguments that followed, no indication of the documentaries filmed or the motions filed. The land does not record verdicts. It does not register doubt. It simply exists. What remains is the record, thousands of pages of testimony, reports, appellate decisions, and forensic analyses. Within that record are facts established, facts disputed, and facts still unknown. Whether future science will narrow that unknown space is a matter for courts and laboratories, not speculation. In the end, the West Memphis case endures because it occupies that narrow ground between certainty and question. 3 boys lost their lives. 3 teenagers were convicted and later freed under an unusual legal compromise. Decades later, the search for complete clarity continues. Some cases conclude with a final ruling that settles every doubt. Others remain open in the minds of those who follow them. West Memphis belongs to the latter, until definitive evidence either confirms or overturns what was decided in 1994. The file remains not entirely closed, not entirely resolved, held in the careful balance between verdict and uncertainty.